We talked about the looming constitutional crisis that might be unfolding for the United States. Now, while not everyone is in agreement that there is a pending constitutional crisis, one of our U.S. Supreme Court justices has pretty much suggested that we're already there. Justice Ketanji BrownJackson was speaking at an event earlier this month, and she gave some remarks. Now, she didn't mention President Trump by name, but she did mention circumstances related to some recent events, which makes it not too hard to understand that she was, in fact, referencing actions by the current executive, President Trump, in terms of trying to intimidate the action of courts in terms of issuing orders and enforcing the law. And she was speaking to a group of fellow judges, and she said to them that they should not be intimidated by the actions of an executive because they have an obligation to uphold the law and to, let history prove them right. And so, this is a very serious situation that this country is finding itself in right now. And you have justices, judges who are taking note of the fact that there is a very serious problem with judges being intimidated. We had a situation recently in a very controversial case where a judge released someone on bond or lowered someone's bond, and there was a huge outcry against the person's bond being reduced, and people started to dox the judge and intimidate her and send her death threats. So judges in this country are facing a very unusual period in history in terms of threats coming at them. So they're being threatened by people in the general public, but they're also being threatened by their fellow government officials who don't like what it is that they're doing and the orders that they issue, and don't want to follow the order of the court. So in terms of talking about constitutional crises, I was interested, and I said, well, when is the last time there was a suggestion that we were in a constitutional crisis? Now, certainly with the events of January 6th, there was some kind of speculation by some that that was a constitutional crisis, but I disagree. I don't think it was a constitutional crisis because you didn't really have an official act on the part of one leader of a branch of government against another branch of government. You had the suggestion that President Trump encouraged citizens, private citizens, to take action against Congress and to storm Congress and to do, unfortunately, what happened on that day. But I don't think there was enough executive encouragement of what happened on January 6th, to say that that was an example of a constitutional crisis. Most people do seem to agree that the last time that this country was in a constitutional crisis was back in the 1960s, when a black student named James Meredith was attempting to go to a school called Ole Miss. I think that's the University of Mississippi. And there was some attempts to keep him out, and he had to go to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court ordered that he be admitted to this school. Now, certainly the 60s were, it was a different climate, and there was a lot of opposition to the possibility that this black student would be enrolled at the school. So the president at the time was John F. Kennedy. The Attorney General at the time, I think, was Robert Kennedy, and they had come to an agreement with officials in Mississippi to permit James Meredith to enroll in the school. But the people in the community were not interested in saying that happened, and so there was a riot. U.S. Marshals had to be called in to, resolve the issue. And so I think that is a kind of a more in line with the idea of a constitutional crisis. You have the U.S. Supreme Court issuing an order. You have the President and the Attorney General attempting to use U.S. Marshals to enforce the order of the U.S. Supreme Court. And you didn't necessarily have the President, you didn't have the legislature opposing it, but what you did have is a state authority brushing up against the authority of the federal government. So that's a constitutional crisis of a different nature, more in line with like the Civil War, where you have the states against, the authority of the state against the authority of the federal government. This situation that we're entering potentially now is more of a federal on federal constitutional crisis, because you have co-equal branches of government that are at odds, and one of those co-equal branches basically saying that another co-equal branch doesn't have the authority that branch, being the Supreme Court, has traditionally exercised and has been respected, during the length of the time that we have been a country. So stay tuned, keep your eyes peeled. Unfortunately, I think this is going to get worse before it gets better, but it's a very important time for the country. It's very interesting to those of us who are lawyers and who have an interest in law, but really it should be a topic that is interesting to all of us, because if this country erupts into a full constitutional crisis, it likely will never be the same.